that spooky cabin in the woods type feel, achieved by creating simple wood textures out of XPS foam and putting some paint on it. Stay tuned to figure out how to make this. Welcome back to Crafted by Metamorphic Customs. This week we'll be figuring out how we can carve wooden textures out of XPS foam. Now, begs the question here, why not just start off with wood? That's a great question. I find that it's actually easier to get actual wooden textures out of XPS foam than it is from, well, using an actual piece of wood. So there you go. What I'm starting off with here is just scrap pieces of XPS that I've cut or even glued together in a few of these cases. You can see some panels here to measure about 15 by 15 for a backdrop and about 15 by 10 and a half for a base or a bottom. And this will be my key tool here. I'm using this wire brush to create the wooden textures, and this is going to be very, very simple. You're just going to drag the brush along the surface of the XPS foam in one general direction. It doesn't have to be perfectly straight, but just one direction, back and forth. And I'm pressing down fairly hard. I want the wire bristles to create this indentation in the piece of XPS foam. This is what is creating essentially the wood grain in the foam. And I'm going to go back and forth several times. The more you do this, the more you press down, apply more pressure, and the more you go back and forth, the more worn the wood will look. And considering we're doing this spooky cabin in the woods, probably a good idea to give it a lot of texture, make it look very worn and old. So that's what it kind of looks like. It doesn't look like much now, but trust me, you'll see what we're getting at later on. So I'm going to do that on the backdrop as well, not just the base, but I'm going to do it across all surfaces. And again, I'm just repeating this pattern, which is just back and forth several times. And then what I'll do is I'll grab this blunt metal sculpting tool. It's not sharp, and I'll use a hard edge ruler here, a metal ruler, to create the wooden panel lines. So you want to make it look like this is like a backdrop made of wooden panels or wooden boards. So to do that, I'm carving a line using this blunted tool about every inch or so. So the wooden panels are about an inch wide. And this helps create that illusion of, hey, this is a wooden wall made up of wooden panels or wooden boards. So again, I'm just going back and forth, kind of making this indentation with this blunt edge about every inch or so. Then I'll go back and use that same tool to further depress those lines, those indentations that I've made. I really want these panels to look like they're panels, so you'll want to see this indentation really show. And then in some areas, I'm using the tool to basically carve it out a little bit, make it look like it's imperfect, make it look like there's maybe a hole in between two of the panels in certain areas that you might be able to see through. It gives it a little bit more character to do that. Again, it's just a worn area, a worn backdrop, or worn floor. I don't want to make it look like it's brand new, so just taking some chunks out of here to make it look realistic. And then I'll also do that just in random places, but also I'll try to do it at the edges where it's going to be easier later on to really emphasize the age of the wood by adding a little dry brush in there. But as you can see, taking some chunks off. Now I'm going to use these 2x4s, which are just square or rectangular pieces of strips of XPS, and I'm gluing this to the bottom of the base. This is going to be the floor area. And I could just have the floor area, the flat piece of XPS foam, sit directly on the surface. This is eventually going to go into a detail, so we could do that. But I find that having these, what I'm calling 2x4s, scaled 2x4s, or 4x4s, I should say, because they're completely squared, gives it really that illusion of, some kind of wooden structure at the bottom. And if it doesn't make sense, what I'm saying right now, it will a little later on. You'll see what I'm talking about. But I am creating that structure just so that it lies flat, and when you put a figure on it, it doesn't kind of teeter-totter. I have to make it as stable as possible. And I will just leave it like that. I mean, I'm going to paint this later on, but for now, let's get a back of a cereal box. I'm using this just because this chipboard or this thin cardboard works really well as a support structure. And I'm creating these two rectangular shapes that are going to be the foundation for windows. I have this thin strip of XPS here that I'm going to use as the exterior or the window frame. As you can see, I'm kind of gluing it down on the edges of the chipboard, the cardboard that I cut out. You'll notice that I'm doing two different windows. One is larger, one is smaller. There's no exact measurement here. I just kind of, whatever feels right. The larger one is going to be for a 6th scale figure, and the smaller one is maybe like a 12th scale figure. And speaking of windows, I cutted them black. That'll come in handy later. And I'm going to use this clear piece of acrylic. It's fairly thin. It looks blue, but it's clear. It just has this protectant film over it that makes it look blue. And I'm going to cut that film to the exact size of the rectangular window frame I just made. Now, if you're probably going to guess what I'm doing here, I'm going to glue this on. And let's remove that protective film. But when I glue this on, there will be a gap between the actual acrylic and the chipboard at the back that I've painted black, creating this very, very, very minor illusion of depth, if you will. It will have some depth. It won't just be clear acrylic with black directly behind it. But that small gap really helps. So let's move on to the painting stage. I've got some Mod Podge with some brown paint. That's it, just Mod Podge and brown paint. The Mod Podge helps to seal the XPS foam, and the brown paint, well, if you're going to seal it, you might as well mix some brown paint into the Mod Podge, and that way you can start painting it. I've chosen a pretty dark brown, not as dark as you can get, but dark brown. Sometimes when you're, and I'm going to just paint everything, as you can see. Sometimes when you're painting wood or creating wood textures from XPS and you're going to paint it, usually you start off with a very light tan, and then maybe you apply some dark washes. I'm going to start off with this dark brown in this case because I want this to look old, worn, and dark. So I'm doing this on purpose. Plus it'll allow the next few steps to stand out a little bit more. You'll see what I mean. So just go ahead and painting all this in, this is the base. And then after this, we'll go ahead and paint in the back, which is what I'm doing right here. And it's just even coverage. Have fun with this. Put on some music, put on some streaming channels here. Just listen to something while you do this. Hopefully this relaxes you. But hey, if you do get tired, go and get the help of your small child, as I've done here. This is my 8-year-old daughter who insisted she help with this project, so why not? Get your kid to help you out. It's always fun to bring them in. Just make sure they're partaking in one of the safe steps of the project. Speaking of, if you like this video so far, hit like and subscribe to support the channel. It really helps, so I appreciate that, guys. Hopefully you're enjoying this. Now look at my daughter go. She did that whole thing by herself. But anyways, let's go back to this now. I'm using the hot glue. This is definitely me now. And I'm going to go ahead and glue those wooden window frame strips down to the window on the exterior. And it's hard to tell in the video, but that small gap between the clear piece of acrylic and the black painted chipboard does give that subtle illusion that there's a window. There's something behind that clear piece of acrylic. So it's nice. It does work out. Got to remember to paint the edges here of the foam. So it's just two thin strips of foam there. And I've gotten these very, very, very thin strips of XPS foam that I've painted brown, and I'm going to adhere them to the middle of the windows there to create that window effect. You can see already that makes a big difference. Now, let's get some winter blue. This is just like a baby blue, a light blue. Here we go. All right, some critical decisions. This is where you might be looking at it and saying, oh my God, did I mess this up? And no, it didn't. This is meant to look like old paint on the wall that has begun to wear out. I'm also putting it on around the windows, the window frames. And I'm also using a sponge to apply here. Just different techniques applying this down, and this will not look this bright in the end. But again, just make it look like chipped paint, worn paint. This has been there for years upon years. Then I've mixed some watered down FW inks, or you can just water down regular paint, regular acrylic paint. Very watery, as you can see, very thin. And I'm just applying it in different areas here. Again, just bringing out that worn and weathered look on this wooden wall. And this wash, this watered down paint really helps to seep into the textures you've carved out. We'll also use an airbrush here. You don't need to do this step, but I'll use an airbrush to add even further detail with this watered down ink. I'm going into just random places, creating depth and textures here by adding some dark brown with this airbrush here. Do the same thing to the floor. Can't forget the floor area. And also, now I'm using a black FW ink, and I'm just basically tracing out the lines I previously carved in that represent the different wooden panels. So I want the wooden panels to stand out. So I'm not being too careful here, but just going in there with the airbrush and hitting those lines. And yes, you can absolutely do this with a regular brush. No reason why you couldn't. But I'm doing it because I'm used to using an airbrush and could do it pretty fast. So this works. And I'll do that on the backdrop as well. And don't worry, looks a little too much now, but we're going to go over that. Next, I'm going to use some trail tan. Any light tan will do. Light khaki, light beige, and I'm just going to dry brush. I'm using a 1-inch brush for this. And again, dry brushing, you get some paint on your brush. You clean most of that paint off on a piece of paper towel. Then you start just brushing back and forth. As you can see, it's just picking up the textures you previously carved into the XPS foam, creating that illusion of wood. And I'm going back with the airbrush and some dark paint just to create even more additional spots here and there of weathering. And the last step, I'll use a piece of sandpaper or sanding sponge to scratch up the windows, the acrylic, to make it look scratched up glass. This is kind of fun. And at the end, with some dramatic lighting, you have this. Neat. Michael Myers has never looked as terrifying. And I think the lighting really enhances this. But even so, even without lighting, it looks pretty good. It looks pretty good on this too. And it works for different scales. Notice the smaller window here. I didn't glue the window onto the backdrop. I just used blue tack to put that window on there. So I can take it off, put the bigger one, put the smaller one, and the back of that window is that cereal box. Balance your breakfast. Oh, by the way, it also fits into a D12 very, very nicely, hence the size. Hope you guys like this video. I'll catch you in the next one.